So we're looking at Rule 901, and we really are now just sort of tying up all the loose ends. In order to get in any piece of evidence, you've got to establish that the thing that you are submitting to the court is what you say it is. And we've talked around this issue. We've talked about the really big issues of whether something matters to a case. It has to matter to a case. It has to be relevant, 401, 402, in order for it to come in. It has to be more, the prejudicial impact of this cannot substantially outweigh the value of the piece of evidence for addressing an issue that's in play in the case. If it's a statement that's made out of court, we know we have to have an exception to the rules. We've talked about character. Now we really are just tying everything up. How can you say that the thing you're offering into evidence is what you say it is? We've talked about this in the context of Rule 104B. The judge has to make this preliminary determination that a jury could find that the facts are as you say they are, based on the evidence you're going to offer them. So now how do we go about doing that? What's that last step? How do you go about saying that this letter is from the person you say it's from? How do you go about saying that this voice recording is in fact of the person you say it is? Well, these things are all addressed in Rule 901, and there's no real complicated standard for this. It's simply that you have to produce some evidence, to show that the thing that you say that you want to offer is what you say it is. You have to offer something to support that conclusion. Not a real high barrier. In fact, it looks a lot like Rule 104B. In fact, it is. But this just gives you some examples. Easiest example, a witness will testify that the thing is what you claim it is. So if it's a gun recovered from the murder scene, this is a chain of custody question that you'll see quite frequently. Officer, is that the gun that you recovered from the murder scene? Yes, in fact it is, because when I recovered it from the murder scene, I put an evidence tag on it, and those are my initials at the bottom. And and then we may have to establish that it was put in the evidence locker room, et cetera, et cetera. But ultimately, it'll be whether the officer put his mark on the evidence tag and can say that is the gun that I recovered, and then that was placed in the evidence room and no one disturbed it, et cetera, et cetera. So you may have to go through a few extra levels. Quite frequently, the parties will waive what's called the chain of custody, establishing that nothing interfered with this physical piece of evidence from the time the officer marked it to the time it's brought to court. But that's a very kind of classic way of identifying an item for a jury. Handwriting comes up with some frequency. It can be, I know Bob's handwriting, and that's it. Item number 3 in the list of exemplars in Rule 901, a comparison of a specimen from a known quantity to another quantity. And this obviously is right after lay opinion on handwriting. And so handwriting is what's meant here, but it wouldn't have to be handwriting. Anytime you ask if this is the known substance, whether that's handwriting or whether that is maybe some even trademark of a drug, for instance. If you watched Breaking Bad, there was a particular drug that only the character of Walt, I forgot Walt's last name, but he was known, his moniker was Heisenberg. Could you say could you have a chemist say, we know this to be Walt's version of I think it was meth they were dealing. This is Walt's version of meth. Is this the same? And the expert could compare and say whether it was or not. Handwriting was probably what was meant most by that rule, but there are plenty of other things where an expert can compare when we have a known quantity from a known source, and we ask if another is like that. The distinctive characteristics of an item. This is kind of a self-authenticating thing. You don't need to have someone come in and testify that something is a dollar bill or a quarter. Or even you could have a coin from the Roman Empire. You'd probably have to have an expert testify that in fact that's what it was, but the expert would be basing it on the characteristics he or she identified from the item itself. Voice recognition. I've heard Bob Costas's voice before. I pick him because he has a fairly distinctive voice. So you actually probably watch television and hear the ads that have voiceovers by famous people, and you probably, oh, that is that James Earl Jones with this is CNN, or other famous people that you've heard. We're actually pretty good at voice recognition, and that's one of the reasons that I think we allow someone who's heard the person's voice to say, yeah, I know his voice, and that's it. Not that terribly difficult. Evidence of who's on a telephone call. You call Bob answers the phone. If he answers the phone, as some people do, and says, this is Bob, then that's even more evidence. But if Bob simply is one of those hello guys, I'm a hello guy, then if you call Bob says hello, that could be sufficient evidence that it was him. Why wouldn't you also have voice recognition? You have to use point number 6 if you're calling a stranger. If you know Bob gets on the phone, you recognize his voice, well, now you've really got it authenticated. I called his number, he answered, and I recognized his voice. Ironclad. But you could call a stranger. A lot of people during this election season have been making telephone calls on behalf of a candidate that they prefer. You might call, Mrs. Johnson, and she answers, and if it's relevant that you spoke with Mrs. Johnson, then the fact that you called her number and she answered is enough to authenticate that that's who you were speaking with. Public records, simply testimony that these things are where you would expect them to be found, and the same thing can work for business records, and the same thing works for ancient documents. You were expecting to find these documents where you found them, and they look inherently trustworthy. And then evidence of a system or a process. So, if you have the expert who wants to testify that the person's blood alcohol level was 0.02 or 0.20, then you could say, this is the chromatographer. We put the sample in there, and it came out with this result. And so we're authenticating this particular number as a result of what came out, or this particular printout as something that came out of the machine after I put the sample into it. Or think about traffic cameras. The traffic camera takes a picture of you, the light's red, you have gone through the camera or gone through the intersection, the camera caught it, and you can offer, this is how the camera was set up. The camera was supposed to take an exposure after the light went red. It did so, and here's what it produced. So that's the result of a process, and someone can simply testify to how that works, and then that document can then be authenticated as something that came out of that particular traffic camera. So that's authentication, and this actually is, this is very commonsensical. Hearsay is not so commonsensical, particularly with the exceptions. Authentication, very low standard, and give me something that suggests this is what it says it is, and we're good to go.